So are you doing it?
Oh, go ahead. We can wait a couple minutes. Yeah.
No, it's fine.
No,
It's
no.
fine. It's fine.
There we go.
There's a fly in here.
Okay. Go ahead.
Welcome, everyone. I am Clare Lopez, Vice President for Research and Analysis here at the Center for Security Policy, where today we have a panel of distinguished author, guests, writers, and the purpose of the panel today is to introduce Elizabeth Sabaditsch-Wolff's new book, The Truth Is No Defense. This book is just recently out, and we're going to let Elizabeth talk about her experience and writing the book and what went into the book, her background, and how we got to where we are. The overall theme for today's discussion and of the book itself is the erosion, the corrosion of freedom of speech across the Western world. Now, I will begin by describing a little bit about the book itself, which has just been published, as we said, and the book consists of several parts. The beginning, and we'll let Elizabeth talk about this a little more, is her own background, her life experiences, both in Austria, where her home is in Vienna, as well as her experiences living around the world as the daughter of an Austrian diplomat, and then later on working in her own right at Austrian diplomatic facilities, especially in the Muslim world, to include Iran, Kuwait, and Libya. I want to mention the second part of the book, though, because there we have chapters of analysis written by other contributors. The first of those comes from Robert Spencer, who many of the listeners and viewers here today will know as the director of Jihad Watch and the keeper of the Jihad Watch daily blog, which is a platform of the David Horowitz Freedom Center. I myself also wrote one of the analysis chapters. Our panel member, Steve Coughlin, who is a senior fellow here at the Center for Security Policy and the founder of Unconstrained Analytics, an author in his own right, especially of his, I think we might call magnum opus, the book that he published just a few years ago, which is Catastrophic Failure. Also with us, on my right, is Christine Brim. Christine, for many years, from 2007 till about 2013, was working here at the Center for Security Policy, where she was the Chief Operating Officer before she departed in 2013. Other chapters include authors that could not be with us here today, but let me mention them because they have written outstanding contributions to this book. One of these analyses is by Gregor Poppink. Another is by Christian Zeitz. Christian Zeitz has worked very closely with Elizabeth, Steve, with Christine, and others at the European Center for Law and Justice. He is working with all of us on free speech issues in Europe. Also, we have a chapter by combination, two authors combined, Henrik Clausen, our wonderful colleague from Denmark, and he co-authored one of the analysis chapters with Christine Brim. And then finally, we have an analysis chapter from Aaron Rhodes. And each of these deserves its own recognition, but I wanted to point out those names to you. So let's begin today by turning to Elizabeth. It's so good to have you here. And let her describe what the book is about, how it came about, and how she got to where she is today in the battle for free speech. Elizabeth?
Thank you so much, Claire. Thank you for having me here. Thank you for hosting me here. Thanks also to the Center for Security Policy for your unwavering support in the past 10 years. From the very beginning, you have stood by my side throughout this ordeal. And I'm glad it's over, but actually the battle for truth and truthful speech has just begun. We're not going to stop. We actually have to become stronger. We have to become more unified. So, to answer your question, why did I write this book? It's easy. The book needed to be written. It was always planned, but I wanted the case to be over. And it was over a year ago. Actually, technically, it was over in March of this year when the European Court of Human Rights decided I could no longer appeal their verdict from last October, from October 2018. And throughout the decade of this, again, ordeal, when I was speaking here in the United States, I was always asked, well, when is your book coming out? You have to write about this. This is so crazy. This is so unbelievable. And most of the time when I gave my speeches, I didn't even talk about what's in the book, all my autobiographical information. I just mentioned that I spent part of my childhood here in the United States, which explains why my English is understandable. But I never really got into any of the reasons why I became, or why I turned into the critic, or the Islam critic and free speech activist that I am. And that's what you will find in the book. And so in March, when the appeal was denied, it was the time to sit down and get this book done. And I can tell you, it took me 2.5 months to write this, because I wrote 2,000 words every day. So I got this done. I wanted to get it done for people to be able to read it this year, because this is hot news, actually. And considering what's happening here in the United States, people really need to read it, because it's not only about to happen here, it's actually already over here.
Yes,
With the exception that you still enjoy the protection of the Bill of Rights and the First Amendment, which we do not enjoy in Austria or in Europe as a whole. So that's why the book needed to be written. It's called The Truth is No Defense, which is exactly what happened. The truth is no defense. I think Steve Coughlin will tell you the story about how we were told in Vienna that the truth can sometimes be considered hate speech. That is another reason why the book needs to be called The Truth is No Defense. And I'm finally, thank you so much also to everybody here on the panel for contributing, for making this book an even better book. And I appreciate your support. Thank you.
Wonderful, Elizabeth. I think the best way to describe you perhaps is a champion of free speech. Briefly, before we move to our other panel members here, could you tell our audience today, just a little bit in an encapsulated form, what your case was about? What was that legal case?
The legal case was about my right to describe the truth as it is, to call a spade. To just recap, I gave a seminar in Vienna, a 12-hour seminar. I said a lot of things. The seminars were fully sourced. Nothing I said was untrue. And as the seminars grew more popular, a young journalist surreptitiously came to the seminar and recorded the seminars, and then a transcript was handed over to the prosecutor's office, who
What were the seminars about? Let's describe for the audience what they were about.
The seminars discussed Islam and its effect on Austrian and European societies. So what I did was describe Muhammad's life and the Quran and the Sirah, his life, his biography, and how this all affects us, because as we all know, and perhaps people do not know, but they need to know, Islam doesn't concern itself with Muslims, with those who adhere to the Muslim faith, but it also targets us. We are also, we non-Muslims, whatever denomination or faith we are an important part of the Muslim faith. I think we need to call it that way. What Sharia law does, and all of you know this probably even better than I will ever understand it, but Sharia law governs the relationship between Muslims and non-Muslims. So that's why we are targeted as well, and we need to know about Islam, because if we don't know about Islam, it's to our detriment. So that's what I was trying to do back starting in 2008. One of the sentences, or part of the discussion, was Muhammad's life, and I described how he married a 6-year-old and consummated the marriage when the girl was 9 years old, which is part of scripture, which is part of Islamic scripture. And I asked a rhetorical question, which was, what do we call this behavior if not pedophilia? Now note that I did not say Muhammad was a pedophile, and this and that has to happen. I said, what do we call it if not pedophilia? Because we're not allowed to call it pedophilia. I know that. That's against the law in Austria. So I wanted to search for another word, knowing that there is no other word than to call this behavior pedophilia. And thank God for the First Amendment that I enjoy here, First Amendment protections that I enjoy here in the United States, because I would not be able to say these words in Austria.
And so somebody then reported you.
Yes, they reported me. It was, I want to make it very clear, it was not a Muslim who reported me. The Muslim community actually didn't really care much. Why? Because they knew that the dirty job would be done by someone else. And they reported me. I then faced trial for incitement to hatred. The trial made it very clear that there was no incitement to hatred ever. But the judge, at her own discretion, which sounds ludicrous to everybody here in the United States, the judge at her own discretion during the proceedings added another charge, which was denigration of religious teachings, which is a blasphemy charge. And that ended the trial. It was very clear that I would be found guilty. I got a fine. I was forced to pay that fine. I wanted to go to jail, could not go to jail for certain legal procedural reasons. And I fought this charge all the way to the Austrian Supreme Court, lost all the way. The reasons for denying me my right to freedom of speech became more ludicrous with every legal step that I took. And finally, after losing at the Supreme Court, I then appealed to the European Court of Human Rights, which is a supranational court of not the European Union, but the Council of Europe, which includes such freedom-loving countries as Azerbaijan.
Oh dear.
And of course, I lost.
All right.
To the detriment of free people in Europe.
All free people everywhere.
All free people
Not just
everywhere.
yourself.
Yes.
All right, with that as our premise and our starting point, let's turn to our other panel members for their insights into your case, your long experience, both of you, Christine and Steve, much longer experience working with Elizabeth, in particular at the annual meetings of the OSCE, Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, and I'll let you both describe those experiences and your thoughts on the case that Elizabeth so courageously fought. Steve, why don't we begin with you?
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. In the high point when World War II was in pitched battle in 1944, the Austrian scholar Hayek wrote a book, The Road to Serfdom, explaining what the dangers were for things like not just fascism and Nazism, which overtook Germany, but also its real equal counterpart, Marxism. And that's why my piece I wrote on the road to serfdom, because what we're seeing right now in Europe as a matter of policy among the countries, and we're seeing it here, is that citizens are being turned into subjects by their elites purposely to do so. And I think we need to start taking account of the fact that we're on the road to serfdom by people who want to put us there. I think it's very important to point out that in the European Court of Human Rights document, the one where they said she was babbling and her babbling wandered into hate speech, they cited Bukhari, which was the site, because I've read the case, they cited Bukhari, the specific Bukhari citation she used to justify her statement on Muhammad.
And
So,
Bukhari is?
Bukhari is the #1 hadith scholar in Islamic law, and his hadith are understood to be dispositive. So the point being is, now I'd like to go back to our history. I think it was in 2013, I think the first time we attended the OSCE together in Warsaw, Poland, that we went to a forum where the Turks were there, and they basically carry the water for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and they had their European OSCE, European
Organization of Security.
Organization for Security and
in
Cooperation in Europe. I kept tripping on E, it's not an O, right?
Uh-huh.
People who were doing the Islamophobia narrative, and it was in that forum with all the players there that we got them to admit something that is still true today. Islamophobia has no core meaning. You know, I want you to understand something. Hate speech has no core meaning. And it's very important to understand that the reason they run parallel with each other is because they're applications of the same narrative. Why is this important? Because with the huge effort of the Islamic world, the Brotherhood in America, the organization, the OIC, Organization of Islamic Cooperation, to criminalize Islamophobia when it has no meaning, is that it gives the state the power to arrest you for any reason or no reason at all. You have given a complete arbitrary writ to them. The same is true with hate speech. So we can not only show this year that organizations have recognized that still Islamophobia has no core meaning, but also recognizing that as the UN is powering into the hate speech narrative to get people to legislate and criminalize it, they are still officially stating it has no meaning. Well, what is this? Well, I'm not going to go into detail now, but what you would call that is a political warfare mass line effort. And we need to understand what political warfare mass line efforts are if we're going to understand how to get at this. And as part of a mass line effort, what are you seeing? You're seeing a united front. And what is that united front? That united front is the alliance of the neo-Marxist left. And I'm going to tell you, if you're still wondering about whether to use the word Marxist or communist, you're still on the, if you can't run with the big dogs, you better stay on the porch. If you're not willing to bring that language in there, you're really not in the game except to get in the way of people who will. That there is an actual alliance between the neo-Marxist left and the Islamic movement. And they say so, and they organize them, and they converge at the narrative level. What is the narrative level? It's the hate speech narrative. The hate speech narrative that evolved out of the politically correct narrative, which is also a neo-Marxist meme. This becomes important because what you're seeing right now is we got the European countries and the OIC, Turkey, to admit that Islamophobia had no meaning. A couple years later, we were in Austria at an OSCE meeting, and what did we get? An official panel of the OSCE to admit that saying something known to be true can constitute hate speech. And I want to read what was explicitly stated there, because when you read the European Court of Human Rights explanation for why they prosecuted her, I want you to realize they're babbling there, and this is the real standard that she got convicted on, and it's the same standard you hear our left-wing politicians try to enact here. This is from the woman who stated it on the panel. Sometimes when you report on facts, and these facts point out a community, then it has to be a source of hateful speech. So your question was, does that mean that hiding the truth can be a means to tackle hate speech? I would answer, sometimes it can, and sometimes it can't. So when is hate speech not hate speech? Well, when they're coming after you. And when is hate speech really hate speech? When They're saying it. So when you see people haplessly, or our politicians whine, cry in their, soup about how come they're going after them but they're not coming after us, it's because the narrative is designed to go after them. It's to go after you. That's the standard that was applied to her. And until we start recognizing the mass line effort, which is a political warfare assault, the Maoist insurgency model, if you will, and understand it clean that way and put it in that language, we will always be bantering around using DC conservative liberal language that is itself ossified. It no longer addresses anything. So what I'd like to point out is we basically had that down. She was convicted for it, and as recently as this September, we actually rammed it right down their throat. Would you say?
I think
We went to the
we
OSC
did.
and we did interventions,
They
and we
didn't
just
like it.
pushed it right down their throat. So much so that the American diplomat had to read a legal statement saying, well, America is not, we're not a part of that. And of course, they kind of were. But with that, I had all these quotes I was going to read, but what I'd like to finish with is just to point out that what you see is a binary in Europe that now is influencing the world. The binary is from the neo-Marxist left, you hate yourself so much that you want to empower the other to destroy you, or you're on the fascist right, which is you love yourself so much you got to destroy everybody else. And because we call it left-right, we're missing the point that from the beginning it was a binary created, well, you go way far back, but we could put it into the Hegelian dialectic, understood properly. And once you put it in there, regardless of which side of that binary you're on, you're always on a path to destruction. And I will tell you, that's the path to destruction that Hayek was talking about when Austria went down the road of serfdom, that they got pulled back out of, that their leaders are pushing them back into, just like our leaders are doing here today.
Exactly
And-
so. No, thank you very much, Steve. That puts this entire situation in very stark terms. With that, and we'll come back to some of those themes that you raised, let me turn to Christine Brim and get your insights into Elizabeth's case, and of course the many different meetings of the OSCE and these other gatherings in Europe that you attended over the years.
Well, I think that the distinction between a serf and a citizen is crucial because
Yeah.
Elizabeth was speaking and teaching and reaching out to people very much as a citizen of Austria. And one of the key things that makes The Truth Is No Defense such an important book is that there have been literally hundreds of people who thought, as a citizen, in whatever country they were in, including this country, the United States, I have a right to speak out. I have a right to be critical of Islam. I'm basing this on facts. They'll come with their copy of quotes. And then they are treated as somebody who doesn't have the rights of a citizen that they thought that they did. Because when it comes to speaking about certain things, and the scope of those things keeps increasing, people don't have the rights, it turns out, de facto, that they thought that they did de jure. And in the chapter that we have on the press that Henrik Clausen and I co-authored, and I'm sorry he can't be here, he's a wonderful Danish analyst on all of these matters and is published widely for years. But one of the things that we touch on immediately is just a list of names. It is reading a list of names, and it's a selective list. There are so many that either we don't know about in detail or that we may just not have gotten the news on, of people who have been variously attacked and stabbed and shot and threatened and had people come to their doors, or they've been fired, or they've been silenced, or their publications have been confiscated. Their books have been withdrawn from publication anywhere. They've had their PayPal accounts and their Amazon Smile accounts and their bank accounts all canceled. They've been on every conceivable kind of hate list, like the SPLC, and they've been on blacklists and targeted, and this is global. It's not just in countries where these people are treated as blasphemers and apostates and are given death sentences. It's also in Europe, where they are treated as apostates and blasphemers, and indeed jihadists go to their houses or go to their places of work and beat them up and threaten them, and in some cases kill them. those are writers, documentarians, public officials, and ordinary citizens who have educated themselves and want to share what they know because they thought they had the right, either under the UN Declaration of Human Rights or under the US Constitution, to do this. And when that happened, frequently, including in this country, their governments simply stand back. At best, the governments don't enforce the law. At worst, the governments become the antagonist, and they enforce Sharia blasphemy law on their own citizens, putting that in ahead of enforcing what people thought was the law of the land. And we see this happen again and again. Some individual goes out and does what they think is absolutely acceptable, and suddenly the force of the entire state, not to mention potential, terrorists in their own in the country, suddenly lands on them. And this book is unique because very few of these individuals, Geert Wilders, maybe a couple others, but very few have had the wherewithal, the knowledge, the biography, the writing ability, the support, the network to capture that experience. But lots of people have had it. And I think that what is unique in Elizabeth's case, and which was picked up by the media, not during most of the case, but very much at the end, when you essentially lost in October of 2018, and then it went for the final request for appeal. After some sort of desultory media attention over the years, suddenly people focused and they said, oh my gosh, this is actually happening. Because so many people thought, oh, well, there's no way that this could actually go to the next court of appeal. And then again and again and again, it would. At the very end, we saw a lot of mainstream media, and I'm just going to mention them because I think it's important that it finally caught the attention, not just of human rights and free speech blogs and associations, although some of those were very important, but it got the attention of The Economist, The Atlantic, which actually covered it pretty extensively, The Washington Post, The Wall Street Journal, Le Figaro, Hollywood Reporter tracked this, was very concerned, Commentary, Washington Examiner, National Review, the Gatestone Institute, which is a nonprofit but which publishes regularly, had multiple articles, literally dozens of articles over the entire lifespan of this case, particularly at the end. And in Europe, think tanks really realized at this 11th hour that this was something that they should focus on. Maybe this was real. Maybe this was actually coming down and free speech was in far greater peril. And the ability to be critical of Islam, or for that matter, and I would add this, to be critical of pedophilia, was actually now at a penultimate stage. And so we see the Institute Montaigne, the Young European Federalists, the European Journal of International Law, European Center for Law, which of course was central to your defense and was terrific throughout all of this. And there's a chapter in the book that's just wonderful by Gregor Popik, who's with the ECLJ. EU Law Analysis, the UK Constitutional Law Institution, group after group after group suddenly said, oh, this is happening, this is real, and we are about to lose to an absurd, incoherent, illogical decision, the right of free speech. And there were a range of interpretations, and some said, well, really the ECHR is just devolving the authority to make these decisions to the nation state, but others were saying yes, but on the other hand, every blasphemy law that's in existence in many of these states still, although not being used by Christians, for whom it was probably originally created, are being opportunistically used by not ordinary Muslims who want to be good citizens, but by the Islamic activists of the particularly Muslim Brotherhood who are professionals who are looking for opportunities to impose silencing and censorship of any kind of factual statement about Islam, which could reflect badly on Islam, which is the Sharia definition of slander, which is a different definition than our definition in the Western law. One of the things that came through in some of the analysis, I think, was that there were 3 tiers, I would say, of how people wrote about this, to the extent that people were scared to write about it at all, because they were afraid that if they did, they would be attacked. It's amazing that it got the coverage that it did. Many people only covered the free speech aspects of it. They did not refer to Elizabeth by name. She was at best, Mrs. S or ES, even though your name was completely out there in the news. They did not touch at all on the Islamic component. There were whole articles dealing with the free speech component that never mentioned the I word, Islam. And others that would touch on it and would say this is an absurd approach to narrowly defining pedophilia, and look at that aspect, but would never tie it in any way to the formal authoritative hadith about Muhammad's life, which does indeed say that he consummated his marriage with Aisha when she was the age of 9, and which is used as a model in incorporated law, in incorporated Sharia law in multiple countries within the Muslim world. And there's a section in this book that talks about that to some extent, because although there is a move, which would have been nice to have had the European Court of Human Rights recognize that a number of Muslim countries are actually making an effort, at least on the books, to outlaw child marriage and to put age of consent at 15 or 16 or 18 or something a little bit older. In fact, that's a real problem because, for example, in Afghanistan, only 5% of marriages are even registered. The guardians of girls and even of boys can overrule any personal decisions. Children are often married at a very young age. The consummation may be, at some other time, but the ability to track what's going on is limited. The fact that there are a significant two groups in particular that were stories that should have been told, that were never told relative to Elizabeth's case. There was a group called Girls Not Brides. It's an NGO. It's a global group. It's over 1,000 civil society organizations in over 95 countries that are working to prevent child marriage, that are working to prevent the rape of children, right, in the name of whatever doctrine is used. And they do not focus just on Islamic child marriage, but they are acutely aware that Islam presents a unique problem here because it is doctrinal in its approval of child marriage. And that's a group that absolutely could have been, the ECHR could have taken the side of the victims, and instead when they talk about denigrating a religion or they talk about creating some sort of risk of a lack of peace in the community, all of which are phrases there, they're not talking about the children and the women and the girls who are victims of this doctrine. They're talking about the extremists who essentially will create problems if they take the side of the victims. So I think the other group that I would urge people to know about here is Women Living Under Muslim Laws, which goes by the French name Femmes sous loi musulmane, has representation in over 70 countries. Another group that's been around now for about 8 years, struggling again to assert the rights of women and children in Muslim countries. Again, a story that should have been covered, should have gotten out in the media, but because the ECHR took the side of the victimizers, not the side of the victims in Islam, and not to mention, of course, denigrating any kind of free speech, these were the stories that weren't told. I think I, like Steve, have a couple quotes that I wanted to read. I will read, if I could, just one, which was by a wonderful European expert from the European Journal of International Law. His name's Dr. Marko Milanovic, and he wrote an article called "Legitimizing Blasphemy Laws Through the Back Door," and he notes that the court engaged in a sleight of hand, as he calls it. He says, "Look carefully what happens here. Religious peace," referring to that phrase, "and religious feelings, which are not mentioned as legitimate aims for the limitation of freedom of expression in Article 10.2 of the Convention, become such under the guise of protecting the rights of others. Religious peace is then defined not simply as an absence of violence, which the applicant's statements were not held to provoke in the first place, but as some more nebulous idea of peaceful coexistence. Then finally, a person's religious feelings are neatly subsumed under the person's rights, In other words, I have a right for my religious feelings not to be hurt. And all this, right or wrong, is simply taken by the court at face value without any kind of critical reflection. And that's really the bottom line of the court's decision, and that's why so many people in the human rights and free speech community, in the press and in the think tank community in Europe and in the United States, realized how both incoherent this decision was, but how dangerous it is, because it says that the definition of hate speech or of denigration of religion is based solely on the other person's perception of hurt feelings, and therefore hate speech is defined solely by the person, not by anything other than the recipient. And that opens, obviously, the potential for a complete totalitarian shutdown of any criticism,
Yeah.
not just of Islam, but of anything.
Absolutely. Such important points and insights, Christine. Thank you. You know, Elizabeth, I want to take you back into a little more of the book and the account of your life. And I want you to tell the audience and us today a little bit about how your experience as the daughter of an Austrian diplomat, and later in your own right, living and working in Middle East countries like Iran and Kuwait and Libya, how did that help form your understanding of Islam firsthand and Islamic law and the kinds of societies that allegiance to and enforcement of subjugation to Sharia create?
Long question, which we'll call probably for a long answer. But I think it's very important because I got to live it. I didn't just read about it. I didn't just watch a movie or what have you. I got to live it, and I didn't live it in just one country. I lived it in a few countries, 2 or 3, 4 countries. So I know what I'm talking about. So first of all, I lived there, and thank God I didn't do any research into Islamic law or read the Quran before I left those countries, because that would have gotten me into a lot of trouble. I'm pretty sure I would have been kicked out of the country, if not worse. So what I did at first, like in Iran, I experienced the revolution. I saw how a fairly free society was transformed into a theocratic, unfree society in a matter of months, sometimes even weeks. And that made a huge impression on me as a 6 or 7-year-old who didn't have a clue about anything, but still understood there was something going on. The demonstrations, the Allahu Akbar cries during the night from the roofs of our neighbors' roofs. It was eerie. All of a sudden, life for me as a 6 or 7-year-old had changed. We had to leave the country because diplomatic dependents were kicked out. We returned only during summer vacation and Easter vacation, and I then got to see how society had changed during the time that I was absent. And again, think of it, a 6 or 7-year-old, all of a sudden everything has changed. Mm-hmm. It's not easy. Then I was in Iraq in 1982, leading into 83. I got to see the other side. I got to see a country at war, a country that was fairly secular, where Christians were free to practice their religion, where Christmas masses were jam-packed, where Christians were not at risk of being killed like they are now, of being persecuted brutally as they are now. But I also saw the rations. I saw what a society at war is like. Then came Kuwait in 1990. I returned to, I was in Kuwait, I liked it. It was a different life for a 19-year-old. Although many of the societal, my experiences with an Islamic society were, reminiscent of what I had experienced in Iran and Iraq. But then, of course, Saddam Hussein got in the way, and I had to flee. Again, I guess I was used to the call to prayer 5 times a day in 1990. It didn't really affect me much, but I was already taken aback. I didn't feel very comfortable living in an Islamic society. That changed dramatically when I returned to Kuwait in 1997. I was 6 years older or 7 years older, and the rebel in me had really grown to an adult rebel. And I describe in the book how, the first Ramadan is kind of, Ramadan, it's different. You experience a time that you and I and all of us here aren't really used to. It's kind of exotic, different. And then by the second and third Ramadan, you're only annoyed. And the rebel in me then would, go to the embassy. I was living in the embassy building and during the workday, went upstairs, got myself my salami sandwich because I had some Austrian salami in my freezer. And I would just walk into the visa section holding my salami sandwich. It was just a kind of protest. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I was just feeling caged by the whole thing. Ramadan doesn't concern me as a non-Muslim, but then again, we all know it does. And I recount many other experiences. I was friends with an Egyptian who did dawah on me. Dawah, the call to Islam. He did what any good Muslim is required to do. So what is he required to do? He's required to convert me. And that's what he tried by taking me to dinner and then asking me to read a book on Islam, any book.
Not the Quran, though.
Not the Quran. He said I got to choose. So you don't tell Elizabeth to read, because that's exactly what she does, and that's what I did. And he asked me all excited, well, did you finally read about Islam and how did you like it? And I made the mistake of saying to him, you actually believe this crap? And then
I'm sure that went over well.
Whoom, he slapped me in the car. And that was that. You learn the hard way. And I, of course, still didn't have the scriptural knowledge that I thank God I didn't have the scriptural knowledge. There were many other stories like that, and I still didn't have enough of an Islamic country after Kuwait, so I then asked the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to transfer me to Libya, where you had a socialist form of Islam with the dictator Muammar Gaddafi and his famous revolutionary treatise called the Green Book. And you again felt, I felt like I was in a cage again. I was suffocating. There was no freedom. And the embassy chauffeur, the embassy driver, made a pass at me, a Tunisian man. Why would he do that? Why? I mean, no other man ever made a pass at me. It was, strange enough, always these people. So it felt really uncomfortable. Again, thankfully I didn't have the knowledge that I have now. It would have gotten me in into a lot of trouble. But I'm grateful because after I returned to Austria and started reading up on everything, I read the Quran, I studied the Hadith, the sayings and teachings of the Prophet Muhammad. I read my Robert Spencer books. I read everything from the Karen Armstrong books, the apologetics, to everything that I could get my hands on. And first of all, I knew we were in trouble as a society, as humans, as Western civilization. I knew we were in serious trouble, and that's how I got started. And my mistake, because when you were talking about how so many people get in trouble with the law in Europe, one of my biggest mistakes, and I also recount that in the book, is probably that I was naive enough to believe that in Europe I had a right to express my opinion the way I can here in the United States under the First Amendment. And I learned the hard way that is not true. If you read the book, you will see I have the First Amendment, and then also the 2 paragraphs from the European Convention on Human Rights, and how wordy the European Convention is, and how simple and beautiful it is it is described or enshrined in the First Amendment.
Absolutely.
It's so easy to understand.
Let's draw on that experience of yours, Elizabeth, and bring in the rest of the panel to think about this. Now, what is the future of Judeo-Christian based societies of the West, like ours, Europe, the United States, if we continue to welcome into our midst large numbers of migrants, refugees, other immigrants from the Islamic world who are obligated by the doctrine of their faith to not assimilate, but rather to do what your contact over there did, try to impose, to proselytize, to engage in dawah, the call to Islam. And they are told in the countries of the West to which they come, ours, yours, others, that we're the ones that need to change, that our societies need to change to conform to their doctrines, their ideologies. What does that portend for the future? Steve, let's start with you, and we'll come down the row here.
Well, I think the biggest shift in how I'm trying to explain the war on terror, the Islamic war on terror, because I started off in the Pentagon up against Al-Qaeda, is the fact that that's not where the main battle's being fought.
Yeah.
The main battle's being fought in Brussels, in Washington, D.C., in New York City, and Los Angeles by what we call soft jihad, which is the wrong term. It's called dawah. But what I'm trying to raise people's awareness of is everything you just said would not happen but for the fact that there are forces in the West that want them here to do that. And so the whole thing gets set up so that we're going to go right over the dog that just doesn't bark by anybody. And if you try to bring it up and you do it haphazard, you do sound crazy, because it can go crazy. But the simple fact of the matter is the European Union and the United States, but especially the European Union, is bringing in an other for the purpose of having you, the citizen, be quiet so they can feel safe. And what that really is the replacement of your values with them. And really, those people don't give a rip about Muslims' concept of what's right. It's about the negation of yours. It's about the turning of your culture, whether it's Austria, whether it's the United States, turning your culture, nihilizing it into nothingness, and turning it into something where you no longer can express yourself. See, I think the idea, one of the things that, made me really look at when I was writing the chapter for you was when you take a look at Article 10 of, the freedom of expression article in the European Union law, which is actually which is the Council of Europe, yes.
European Convention on Human Rights.
That's right, is that it's cast as their First Amendment. But the first part, it's 2 parts to the Article 10. The Article 10 kind of sounds like the First Amendment. The second part says, well, so long as the state lets you have that right. And the fundamental difference between the Bill of Rights, American Bill of Rights, is they're premised on the idea that man was made in the image of God. Now let's just explain this for atheists. What does that mean? It means that the American concept of rights are that rights exist before the state and ahead of the state, and the people are sovereign. You don't have to go to a church or a synagogue for that, okay? So what you have is rights endowed by the Creator being replaced by privileges granted by the state. And the one,
which can be revoked at any time.
which makes it,
Exactly.
a privilege is
Good
always
point.
revocable. So we have been operating under the illusion that in Europe, they had free speech and they never had it. And a country that pretends to have it has it, it's even worse, is the UK. But now what's happening is they're imposing that standard in the United States. That is the de facto standard if you go on TV. It's the de facto standard if you lose your job. So, I want to go back to this political warfare thing. That's not being done by the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood in the 1980s said, we see this neo-Marxist narrative, and we see it's going to take down the West, and we are going to create the word Islamophobia, hire some elite left-wing think tanks in London to create a whole narrative about it, and jam that down the Westerners' throats and get their countries to prosecute people for it. Because we're not going to let them talk about our values.
Yeah,
And I think it's
exactly.
exactly what happened.
This is exactly what happened. Christine, what
Yeah,
would you be
well,
your thoughts on?
I would agree on that, absolutely, and I think that you can even pull the lens back slightly and say that the techniques of totalitarianism are known, and they're the same. And they're the same, and they show up across history, and they show up across, they each have their own cultural manifestation, whether it's Islamic, or it's communist, or it's National Socialist. But ultimately, one of the first things you have to do is to get people to refuse to acknowledge the facts in front of them. You have to make it illegal, either through custom and taboo, or through direct laws, and to have people deny the facts that are in front of their very face, especially if those facts are potentially dangerous to the citizens. The citizens have to be put in a position where they accept that danger and they deny that it exists. That includes criticism of the elites themselves, so that you get a muzzling effect. The other thing that you see is a kind of random, arbitrary negative reinforcement. Bruno Bettelheim talks about this in his books on concentration camps, for example. But picking picking somebody, lots of people have been critical of Islam, but pick one, make a test case as a model for the others. The process, the punitive, legal, expensive process is in fact the punishment. And the greater the visibility of how you can take one individual, put the full force of the state focused on them, and make them an example, will silence as many others as possible, which is why your point, Elizabeth, that you said in the very beginning when you were talking, you said we need to be more unified. I think that's very much the case. I mean, I think, and I'll toss out an example where that failed. A young woman, Molly Norris, tried to do that very thing where it was everybody draw Muhammad. So under Islamic doctrine, pictures of Muhammad are forbidden, they're blasphemous, and punishable by death if you do that, if you make a picture. And so Molly Norris, to try and encourage not just an individual to speak out, but to do a kind of mass civil disobedience, did Everybody Draw Muhammad Day. And it was lighthearted, and it was like a picture of a box saying, I'm Muhammad, and a picture of a teapot saying, I'm Muhammad. She was a cartoonist. And within a month, she had to go underground. She has never been heard of since, and at least what is reported is that the only assistance, and I don't know if this is true, but what's reported is the only assistance she got from the FBI in our country was that she was told to go underground and possibly given some assistance in forging a new identity, but that was it. In the United States, the First Amendment protects you from the state forcing you to say one thing or another, up to a point. The Brandenburg decisions and others, you can't have an immediate call for violence. But there's a wide latitude of what the state has to permit to go on. But the state can stand back and allow the mob, whether it's the Islamic mob or the Antifa left-wing mob, or
The Google Twitter
terrorists,
mob.
the Google Twitter mob, the Amazon banking, PayPal mob, to silence you through corporations, to silence you through social media, or to silence you through direct action. So as an heir to Molly Norris, Pamela Geller held a kind of Muhammad cartoon contest in Garland, Texas, which then was disrupted, attacked by two gunmen who fortunately were stopped. But it turned out that the FBI's informant had been following along with that and had in fact allegedly incited it. And the FBI knew, and the FBI didn't stop it. So again, as we know, in the US, we do have the First Amendment. But we also have, all the state has to do is stand back and not enforce protection of the citizens. And I think that goes to what Steve is saying, which is that as a citizen, I don't know my glasses so I can't see it, As a citizen, you would expect the state to give you the same protections that they would for everyone. It's liberty for all, it's equal protection under the law, right? We expect that for everyone here. That means your civil liberties, and it's a negative liberty in this country, it's not a positive
Yeah.
right. We are free of the state, right? The state doesn't grant us rights. We have those laws from God. We have those rights from God. But we expect the state to protect us all equally, and the state can selectively say, no, I'm sorry, you're on your own.
This is a grim outlook
Yeah.
that we've been talking about here today. We have only a few minutes left.
And I need to
in
add
these few
something.
minutes, well, what I would like to do, and
Yeah.
we'll ask each in turn, where do we go from here? What do we do about this? As free citizens still in the United States, if not Europe, what do we do from this point forward? Elizabeth, I know you want to jump in here.
I needed to jump in because I wanted to discuss the recent poll saying that 51% of millennials want fines or jail time for hate speech. And that is indeed grim. If you have more than 60% of Americans agreeing on restricting speech some way, you have 51% wanting to see the First Amendment rewritten to reflect the cultural norms of today. I mean, all my hair stands up. It's like this is unbelievable, especially because who decides what are the cultural norms of today?
Well, and this
Who
is
gets to
coming
decide that?
out of our academic institutions,
Yep.
the universities, the colleges, where I would
Yep.
argue the communist Marxist left has paved the way for the infiltration
And
of
the
the
marriage
Islamic
to always
Repressive
see-
tolerance.
And what you
Repressive tolerance.
exactly,
Exactly.
you're gonna talk about repressive tolerance. So if you're asking me what do we need to do, first of all, I'm an Austrian. I don't lecture Americans on what exactly to do, but what
We're
I do.
children of the Enlightenment.
But
Think of it
as a
that way.
child of the Enlightenment, I tell you, you Americans still have the freedom to defend freedom, to fight for freedom. You have the means to do it. You have to, of course, take back your learning institutions. That can be done on a very local level. Again, you have the means to do it. And remember also, without America, there's no place to go. So the burden is on you. I will do my best to stand with you, to stand by your side. I will do my utmost to help you. But as a non-American, I look to you Americans to defend free speech and Western civilization by default, of course.
Absolutely. Steve, last thoughts.
I think it's very important to understand that underlying all this political correctness, the saying is political correctness is the enforcement mechanism to multicultural narratives that implement neo-Marxist objectives. It has always been that. And I think it's very important. We know that in the early 1970s, Marcuse joined the Long March. The Long March was the Maoist Long March. So we know, and that his number one goal was to do it by taking over the university campuses. So they not only control the campuses, what we like to euphemistically call a deep state is actually a counter state and by their own narrative. It's very important that what he implemented, among other things, is repressive tolerance, such that everything means its opposite. Okay, and we need to understand that that had a strategic decade over decade application, because what you're experiencing is the antithesis of tolerance, understood to be normal by people who we let our children go to public schools to be turned into Marxists.
That's what's happening.
Okay, and so we need to understand that that's the score, but we also need to let those kids understand that you're just as clueless as everybody's making fun of you for. And you have to make a decision to do something about it.
Absolutely. Christine?
Well, one last thing, which is that obviously Europe and the Islamic doctrine and the EU are not the only repressive societies that we have to deal with globally. China, for example, is at least as repressive in its own way. Technology is going to be a huge factor here in increasing the power of the state and corporations to jointly and separately be extraordinarily repressive on not just free speech, but on behavior, and to be able to use things like financial systems to craft the exact behavior that they want, as well as silencing people through social media. So I think that things will get much, much worse as before they potentially can see some pushback. But I think pushback is already there. And to go to your point about Marxist weakening of Western civilization and of the Enlightenment and of Judeo-Christian traditions being our weakest point, right? That's the breach in the wall through which Islamic doctrine or anything else can come in and weaken all of our culture and our nation states. We do have those countries which did live under the heel of Marxism and Soviet Russia, who now are to some extent much stronger.
Eastern Europe.
Eastern Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a mixed picture, but they certainly are not naive about Marxism. They are, and we also have parties, whether it's Brexit or parties that come and go in Italy, or parties, the AfD in Germany, certainly small parties which keep growing in size in Sweden, Swedish Democrats and others, and in Spain, Vox, I think it is,
Vox.
who in a variety of flavors, and they're not all identical, but are pushing back, and they're pushing back against the dirigist centralized projects. They're pushing back in favor of personal, family, and private property, and in some ways they are also self-identified as pushing back against the great technocratic project, which we see happening with the large social media corporations and data gathering and the Marxist state. So there are countervailing forces always in history. The question is, how can we unite those as much as possible, or at least encourage them? And how can we provide protection for the heroic citizen, whether it's Elizabeth or 100, 1,000 other people out there right now who would like to say what they know, what they've studied is true, whether it's about Islam or it's about some other topic, but who are terrified and chilled and silenced because they're afraid either of what the state will do to them or of what the state will permit the mob or corporations to do to them. How do we help those people, and how do we create a new infrastructure to support them in the future?
Exactly. And with that, I think we have come to the end of our time today. I want to thank Elizabeth especially for your courage,
Thank you.
for your scholarship, for this new book, The Truth Is No Defense, and for your example to all of us for how we must take up the fight here in the United States and hopefully elsewhere. I would like to thank Steve Coughlin, who has been with us today, as well as Christine Brim. Thanks to all of you for joining us, and we look forward to the future with at least some hope and some idea of what we must do. Thank you all very much.